We are the Stonewall girls, we wear our hair in curls. We don't wear underwear, we show our pubic hair. This was a song incorporated into the kick line of the rioters outside the Stonewall Inn. Stonewall has become synonymous within a large part of the gay community as the starting point for the modern gay liberation movement. The Stonewall riot marks a significant moment in civil disobedience history in the United States as well. This claim is also marked by some strong criticism. How legitimate can these riots claim to be as a political movement when the riots were not directed at a specific law? Rather, the riot that night was unorganized and spontaneous. To work through this problem of legitimacy, doing a brief review of the Stonewall riot history is in order. The riots occurred on June 27, 1969, after a raid by the NYPD. Raids were not uncommon on gay bars, or rather locations associated with the homosexual community during this time. During this time of Stonewall, it was illegal for gay bars to openly exist. Therefore, many of the bars were illegal establishments and in some instances had connections with illegal organizations. The Stonewall Inn was associated with mafia members and the overall condition of the bar was poor, to put it gently. There was no running water behind the bar and plumbing often overflowed. While there was no prostitution transactions, there were a decent amount of drug activity. However, despite these seedy conditions, the Stonewall Inn was the gay bar of Greenwich Village because it was a place where homosexual men and women, as well as drag queens, could congregate and dance openly, if at least for a few hours. The raid on Stonewall took place on Friday at 1:20 a.m., where around 200 patrons were in attendance. The raid took on the following procedure. The patrons were told to line up and have their identification ready, and those in drag were taken to the bathroom by a female officer to verify their sex. If they were exposed to be male, they would be arrested for being in women's clothing. This night, however, the gay patrons were not cooperating with officials. Those who were not arrested gathered outside the bar, and an angry mob began yelling and harassing police officers as they loaded up arrested patrons to the paddy wagon. This verbal back and forth escalated to the crowd of angry homosexuals hurling coins, garbage, and garbage cans at the police officials, who had to barricade themselves into the Stonewall Inn until backup could be reached. The riot lasted until the wee hours of Saturday, and from this, the gay pride slogan began to take its shape. Historically speaking, this moment was significant, but to what extent is the Stonewall Inn philosophically relevant? As mentioned earlier, there is some tension surrounding the legitimacy of the riot. The Stonewall riot was just as the name implied, an angry mob of homosexual individuals who had had enough discrimination from the police and legal authorities. The riot was not directed at the illegitimacy of any specific law. According to John Rawls, the Stonewall riot can't be classified philosophically as an act of civil disobedience. According to Rawls, an act of civil disobedience is that which is nonviolent, public, conscientious, yet political act contrary to law, which is done in the effort to bring about a change in laws or policies of the government. Rawls defines civil disobedience in this way in order to emphasize the importance of addressing and appealing to the sense of justice shared by the whole community. By definition alone, the Stonewall riot would hardly qualify as a legitimate act of disobedience because not only was the riot violent to property, police, and other rioters, but it also did not invoke a community sense of justice. The Stonewall riot seemed to invoke a sense of shared vengeance that the Stonewall patrons and selected Greenwich Village homosexuals had over repeated humiliation from the NYPD. Even though Rawls' definition of civil disobedience does bring in an important criticism to the legitimacy of the Stonewall riot, Rawls' use of indirect disobedience opens up another possible spin to the legitimacy of this riot. Rawls states in his argument that by breaking not the law held to be unjust, but instead breaking a parallel law in order to build one's case against the unjust law is perfectly acceptable. To expand upon this use of indirect disobedience, Jean Morial's argument of the justifiability of violent civil disobedience is appropriate. Morial brings up the notion of prima facie rights, and one of those prima facie rights being a man or woman's primary right to the autonomy of his or her body. So when the police officials forced the drag queens of the Stonewall Inn to show their genitals to prove that they were indeed men in women's clothing, the police officers were forcibly violating the drag queen's right to choose how his body would be clothed. The police officers were directing psychological violence onto the drag queens. So a possible legitimate connection can be drawn between the violence of the patrons to the police officials. The homosexual patrons were protesting indirectly against the accepted treatment of homosexuals by police officials. The homosexual patrons were violently protesting and defending their prima facie right to the autonomy of their body in the presence of state officials, those state officials being the NYPD. Another important argument to include in this analysis of the Stonewall riot is Michael Walzer's The Obligation to Disobey. In Walzer's argument, he brings to the light that men and women have a prima facie obligation to not the state, but to the groups which he or she is a member of. On June 27th, the homosexual patrons had a stronger moral obligation to defend the legitimacy of their members. The Stonewall riot marked a notarizing of the homosexual community by a few of its more radical Greenwich Village members. The Stonewall riot, from its violent protest, sparked the action of many gays, lesbians, and transgender members to fight for their ability to be recognized by the United States government as not sexual deviants, but as legitimate citizens with a different lifestyle. While the Stonewall riots seem like a weak case alone, when compared to the timeline of the gay rights movement, the strength of the incident increases. Prior to the Stonewall riots, many other riots and raids throughout the nation caused similar small-scale riots. Such riots include the Compton Cafeteria Riot of 1966 and the New Year's Raid of 1965 in San Francisco, along with the homophile efforts to persuade the government agencies to accept homosexuals and as non-sexual deviants. When compared with the historical timeline, the Stonewall riots take on a legitimacy as a movement of justified civil disobedience.